Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Members of Council of the University of Zululand who may be online, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University, Professor Kolisam Tose, our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Mulifi Kete Asante, and his wife, Anna Asante, members of management present, deans of faculties, heads of departments, academics and students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have a singular honor of welcoming you to what will prove to be the highlight of this year as we host one of the most influential luminaries of our times, Professor Mulifi Ketasante. As you may have noticed in the invitation, Professor Asante has authored more than 100 books and more than 500 scholarly articles. Professor Sante, at one stage, was persuaded by my younger brother, Jimmy Siepe, to become a regular guest columnist for the City Press. He was also invited by none other than the former president, Thabo Mbeki. So, what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that you are in the presence of greatness. Professor Asante and I go as far back as the 80s. And I was telling him this morning that I had the pleasure of going through his book, Afrocentricity Theory of Social Change, early this morning. And I was always, as I was moved by the book when I read it in the 80s, and it also moved me this morning. And Professor Sante, it still remains a necessary antidote to those suffering from Eurocentrism and white supremacy. The book is, as many people have said, a very inspired work that should be read repeatedly. And as people have said, it will remain one of his most enduring contributions. So we are pleased as the University of Zululand, a university that is striving to be an authentic African university, to have Professor Asante with us. Indeed, Professor Asante has followed on the footsteps of what Chinua Achebe said, that until the lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. In the Afrocentricity, what you find is a reflection of the best of African agency. Like the Black consciousness movement, Afrocentricity locates the possibility of change and the responsibility of change within the Africans themselves. It is what you may call, Professor Brown, a planetary and global response to Eurocentrism that often masquerades as universalism. At the center of Afrocentricity is the role of culture. To quote Professor Asante, he says African Renaissance is only possible if it is grounded on African ideology, distinct from a Eurocentric ideology that allows African agency, that is, a sense of self actualizing based upon the interests of African people. Professor Asante, next to you is a Professor Mtose, who heads this university, who had the foresight to be able to say this notion of saying we can create an African university is an idea whose time has come. It's an idea that has eluded many other leaders of institutions. And with Afrocentricity, we embrace it as a positive ideology. As you put it, the best road to all health, economic, political, cultural, and psychological in the African community is through a centered positioning of ourselves within our story. This is what Professor Mtose has sought to achieve when she decided, out of not arrogance, but out of a sense of agency, that the university would become a node for African thought. So I thought it would be important to frame what the VC has tried to do. And without waste of time, I would like to invite the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Zululand, Professor Mtose, to make her welcoming and preliminary remarks. Professor Mtose.
Molweni. Sanbonan and greetings this morning. The University of Zululand Chairperson of Council, Professor David Mabunda, and the council members who have joined us online this morning, executive members of the University of Zululand, my DVCs that are here, but I would like to make a special mention of Professor Nomlomo, who has brought the festivities of this week and made them possible. Starting from today up to Friday, you're going to be fed up because you're going to be well fed with ideas. So she calls that being fed up. That's Nomlomo's language, not mine. The management committee, including my deans and the deputy deans of the faculties, the staff and students of the University of Zululand, Professor Siepe, who's chairperson of this session, Professor Byron Brown, who will be a respondent this morning. Most importantly, our guest speaker of today's webinar, Professor Mulifi Asante, from Philadelphia, United States of America. I think some might think she's coming from Lesotho because of the surname. I just felt it is important to say where he comes from. Professor Anna Yenenga, who happens to be Mrs. Asante. I chose this morning, Professor Anna, to call you by your title because as women, we should liberate ourselves from being Mrs. into becoming ourselves with our own titles that we worked hard for. So I'm proud of you and I love you so much for being your professor and being yourself, but still remain married, understanding that you are married, but you were born single. That's my philosophy in life. So for what I'm meant to do this morning as instructed, so to say, by Professor Siepe, who's a master of ceremonies this morning, and everything else that he has been named in this program, I choose to greet you and say thank you to those even that have joined us online. As part of my introduction, I would like to say some 3 years ago, at the inaugural conference to launch the vision of developing UniZulu as a node for African thought, we declared that this project was a way of becoming an intersection of African scholarship that privileges the epistemologies, rich history, culture, and agency of people of African descent, regardless of where they are in the world. At the same conference, the then Minister of Higher Education and Training, Dr. Blade Nzimande, endorsed the venture and called it bold and ambitious, entailing the need to consciously develop new paradigms, bodies of knowledge, and modes of teaching and learning. Indeed, from the day of that game-changing and historic event, we have traveled and continued to progress along the road. The significance of focusing on African thought have been succinctly captured by Professor Siepe when he said, quote, "Universities Africa have tended to mimic Western scholarship rather than reconfigure the higher educational sphere into a wonderland of authentic African centricity. Subordinated and sidelined, African thought and knowledge has contributed little to the global bank of knowledge or to the material needs of the continent and its people. The task of reorientating and rejuvenating knowledge generation and its ownership is enormous. It requires giving pride of place of African thought and restoring intellectual confidence after century-long colonial subjugation, unquote. Program Director, Professor Siepe, I'm glad to say today, some 3 years after the launch of this vision, UniZulu is seized with a task of reorientating and rejuvenating knowledge. According to Siepe again, the process has reached a stage where intense and practical faculty-level workshops designed to orientate and active steps and innovations for the decolonization of the curriculum and pedagogies across the university has been successfully run in the year 2024. But ladies and gentlemen, from today and for the next few days, I have a feeling that we are landing at yet another threshold level, one where we'll be stimulated not only to accommodate other angles and perspectives of achieving our vision, but also in the process of shake up and or consolidate our prior understandings. In short, this is a defining moment in our journey, a time when we have to adjust our compass bearings as we traverse the landscape of the decolonial praxis. The terrain, as anticipated in the minister's speech at an inaugural conference I referred to earlier, is littered with colonial snares that will appear to us as beacons that purport to direct us to where we want to go. Yet, they may lead us astray. In sharing the foregoing cautionary notes, I have been prompted by two sources of inspiration. One, the one that comes from what we have been learning during the course of implementing activities anchored on the vision of building a node for African thought. The other emanates from my limited exposure to some of the most profound insights from the work of our guest speaker, Professor Asante, who has already been introduced. Amend on these pillars of consciousness. My welcome of this fourth webinar of the year is couched in terms of a beckoning call to develop our own canons of rigor and intellectual astuteness that will enable us to navigate our paths around the colonial snares, which may or may not be visible along the way. This, in practical terms, seems to have to go to intellectually exercise ourselves as we march forward, at the same time inventing authentic tools that will pave the way to where we are going. I shall illustrate how I see this happening by extracting lessons from the writings of Catherine Iwash, a decolonial scholar, activist, and educator. I will end by drilling down these ideas into our situation here at the University of Zululand. But first, let me deal with the intellectual exorcism. Why exorcism? Now, I know to many the term exorcism conjures with the image of a priest or a sangoma. For some, the other person perceived to be an exorcist, and the one who cleanses a person of evil spirits or demons. Just in case some might be wondering, am I not about to shisa impepo here to exercise us? I leave that to its appropriate African context, which are to be respected. Here, I'm using exorcism in a broader way to refer to the process of identifying and doing away with obfuscating ideas, concepts, and Western colonial grand narratives in which we were trained and which we view the world. We learned from Asante 2020 that in waging a decolonial struggle, we must guard against borrowing theories and concepts from Western writers and thinkers. Such scholars may present themselves as progressive, yet when one casts a sharp decolonial eye, one discovers that the knowledge they produce is tied to a worldview that is neither related to the rise of African consciousness nor African liberation from the tentacles of Eurocentric epistemes, unquote. The message here, as Hiepe counsels, we must wean ourselves off from depending on Eurocentric thinkers for answers to our existential problems. Instead, we must assertively reclaim our right to think, theorize, and interpret the world from where we are located, dialoging but not contaminated by Eurocentrism. Black Deer 2024 stated it bluntly that we have to, open quote, exercise the inner colonizer within our minds, close quote. It is by doing this that we can chart our way forward in our own terms for our survival as Africans. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you by now can see, it is with great excited anticipation to let you know that the intellectual exorcism I'm evoking and invoking here is a toolkit in the form of Afrocentricity paradigm, created by an African and a thought leader scholar who will be addressing us this morning. We are indeed privileged and feel hugely affirmed by this unique opportunity to interact in person with the laureate of his torture. I believe the Afrocentric paradigm will open our eyes to a compendium of conceptual and theoretical philosophical vantage points that will guide our way as we enact with the decolonial praxis in teaching and learning encounters. The implications for pedagogizing African thought at UNIZU. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, I would like to urge all of us to be intensely reflective and reflexive as we deliberate on today's topic and hold conversations with our guests for the next few days. This necessarily entails looking back at what we understand has been the understanding of decolonial African thought and how to enact it during pedagogical encounters. It also means that we think about how to embrace and enhance our practices as we are going forward. My call is predicted on the fact that as educators, our work is inherently pedagogical. This point is captured by Sichal 2004, propositioning that we teach is in on itself a pedagogical invitation. Knowledge is always by someone, for someone, always positioned and positioning, and consequently is always already pedagogical. Do you understand that English? Do you want me to repeat? I can. But putting it differently, The thought systems of the dominant are reflected in the content of what is taught. That's the interpretation I'm giving you. In other words, it is that which has been taught by the dominant group under coloniality that becomes content of what is taught. You can see the connotations here for the intellectual exorcism and the necessity for creating alternative thought systems. Nevertheless, viewed from this angle, pedagogy becomes inseparable from what is being taught. Hence, the need to think about what we teach and how we teach it in ways that free the content from the thought system of the dominant. Professor of history sitting here. To incorporate our African thought systems and de-link from epistemic bondage. I shall come back to this idea later. It has been argued that to develop counter-hegemonic teaching and learning activities, we must pedagogize thought systems. It is in this phenomenon that I now turn to understanding pedagogization. Working from a decolonial lens, WALS 2015 encourages us to think of pedagogy as a verb rather than a noun. And so we go into teaching and learning encounters. We should see ourselves as pedagogizing. Elaborating on and in concurrence with WALS pedagogization approach, Castenda Pena and Mertens Merevera 2022 raised two main points that should guide decolonial educators. They see pedagogization as, open quote, way to decolonize traditional understanding of pedagogies, arguing that decolonial turn implies a change in pathways which are rooted in Western rationality, that there's an alternative which is a decolonial one. This decolonial option is based on pedagogization rather than worn out colorate. Close quote. Not simply as abstract speculate, but as a way of existing in the world. In other words, they say, to consolidate this idea of theirs, they say, open quote, pedagogization is context sensitive, and it is about putting contextualized processes where actional standpoint takes place, not about trying out pedagogical formulas or recipes that validate how functional or practical teaching learning is. It is about turning pedagogy into action to move and activate political, cultural, and situated social processes. Any pedagogization is rooted in delinking processes, close quote. What arises from the foregoing points is a sense, a warning to decolonial educators not to enact pre-packed concepts of pedagogy, which may not have been produced in the context, but to address the material conditions of where they are located, and without those for whom such pedagogies must serve. Instead, they should create action-oriented concepts which arise out of and in which they are located, in with those purpose they should serve, in this case, our students. Learning from pedagogization journey to Catherine Walsh. The story of Catherine Walsh bears testimony to concrete expression of pedagogization perspective. In narrating her transformative journey, which was guided by Paulo Freire, thought, whom was, according to the title, a grandfather and ancestor of sorts of critical pedagogy, reveals two strands of life shifts in her pedagogization journey. when she underwent learnings, unlearning and relearning to learn about what and the how of the decolonial praxis. With regard to the what, whilst coming from the position of being a militant intellectual activist and educator, writes, open quote, it was through the conversations and collaborations with indigenous leaders and communities that I started to doubt what I thought and I knew, close quote, about, among other things, revolutionary critical pedagogy. In enacting this pedagogy, Welsh began to see that shortfalls of pedagogy influenced by enduring Western frames of reference, which outlined to exclude and negate other forms of knowing. What Walsh witnessed while working with indigenous communities pushed her to think from alongside and with radically distinct politics and lived experiences of the people. This challenged many of her Western tenets of critical thoughts. With regard to the how aspect of decolonial praxis, Walsh found some resonance, although not totally, with Freudian approach to pedagogy of the oppressed as a productive socio-political process and practice, as an essential, indispensable methodological grounded in people's realities, subjectivities, histories, and struggles. Walsh recognized these aspects as essential features of pedagogizing decolonial thought. 3 points can be drawn from Walsh's journey. Point number 1, it is possible as we journey across contours of decolonial praxis, we can generate ideas about how to exercise what is falsely presented as decolonial pedagogy. Number 2, when Western critical pedagogy may not necessarily deliver decolonial ways of being, thinking, knowing, sensing, feeling, doing, and living, that challenge is Eurocentric logic. Number 3, and the last. In this connection, it is argued that critically should not be seen as abstract postulate. It needs to be reconceptualized, exercised, in other words, within a decolonial framework so that it becomes a stance, an exercise that arises out of a thought, thinking, imagining, intervening, constructing, and working in a radically different world from that of the dominant. Pulling all these points together, we must therefore ask the following questions with reference to the intellectual and pedagogical pathways walked by Catherine Walsh. Where do we see ourselves in relation to pedagogizing African thought? What pedagogical activism do we, up to now, consider whole? And what features of the journey are we identifying for intellectual exorcism? Program Director, against the foregoing reflective prompts, allow me, as we prepare to explicitly midwife the Afrocentricity paradigm into the repertoire of our grammar of change, to briefly share with you a growing interest in pedagogizing the African philosophy of Ubuntu. Pedagogizing Ubuntu in making a case for the development of Ubuntu philosophy as a decolonial pedagogy, ABIT 2022 postulates that the perspective is an educational philosophy of learning for life, which has ontological and epistemological, as well as identifiable pedagogical intersections with Paulo Freire's philosophy of education for liberation. Ubuntu pedagogical construct, or Ubuntu Goji, in a recent review of literature of the concept of Ubuntu Goji, Mthimkhulu 24 explores it as a method of teaching and learning that is emerged from African theory and philosophy of Ubuntu. The term is attributed to the work of Bangura, 2005, who called Ubuntu Goji an African educational paradigm that transcends pedagogy and which is appropriate for teaching and learning in an African classroom. Mthimkhulu also concludes and recommends that Ubuntu Goji is a viable pedagogical construct to be utilized in African classroom and goes on to highlight a number of features that resonate with and define Ubuntu perspective on life and education, and with the idea of those protagonists and pedagogization. Two of these elements include Ubuntu Goji. One, has the potential to reconnect students with their indigenous values, heritage, and culture. But it also had the potential to instill Ubuntu social values such as coexistence, respect, and cooperation among other learners. That's what Ngubane and Makua in 2021 says. The second point, it is associated with community, citizenship, and pastoral role. The educator assumes the role of a good citizen and also makes certain that learners are situated in an environment that makes the process of teaching and learning conducive for effective learning to take place. In sum, Ubuntu Goji can be seen to be rooted in lived experiences of Africans and thus becomes a vehicle for synthesizing African ontologies and epistemologies in teaching and learning. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to invite you to add into the decolonial menu the Afrocentricity paradigm as one of the essential ingredients that we should use to exercise colonial traps that may be embedded or be sneaked into the discourses of revolutionary critical pedagogies. I have no doubt that the milestone we are approaching today and for the rest of this week will give new impetus to the pedagogizing of African thought at the University of Zululand. Professor Nomlomo, I hope this opening paper paves the way for your conference and for our guest speaker for this morning. With these words, warm welcome to all and wish you robust deliberations. And I thank you and I wish you well a productive conference as we continue this week. Thank you very much.
Vice-Chancellor and the principal of the university, thank you for reframing the discussions for this week. I can assure you, having worked with Professor Asante and quarreled with his work for the last 40 years, at the end of this week, there is going to be an intellectual exorcism. The exercising is going to happen, and it's going to start now. What you will find in Professor Sante is what is called shifting the biology of reason. It is also about shifting the geography of reason. I will not try to speak for him, so I will call Professor Asante to take us through this intellectual exorcism by giving us a paper on the governing concepts of Afrocentric pedagogy. Professor Asante, you are you able to connect it? Or it's connected? We're here. Okay, can you just say connect? Oh, I see. Good. Thank you. Thank you. It's fine. I'm fine. She has it. Yes. Well, it's okay. I think I'm okay. Sarabon. Um, I am totally this morning overwhelmed. I remember uh, a story that I heard a long time ago, and it said that the women chatted at the well that Shaka would never be king. But as they gossiped, he was entering the third year of his reign. And when I come to the University of Zululand, Honorable Vice-Chancellor Ntozi, I have discovered here at this university, by listening to you and Professor Siepe and having conversations with Professor Nomlomo, that you are entering the third year or more of your Afrocentric path, even while people are gossiping at the well. Oh, they don't know what they're doing. I am delighted to be here. I'm honored to be a part of your uh, entourage of exorcists. I want to start by saying that we are all the children of our mothers, and in fact, at some point, and we have students who are working on this, we will discover that before history, that the turn from matriarchy to patriarchy was perhaps the most dramatic turn in the history of humanity. Because we all know that we are from mothers and that we recognize that patriarchy has brought us lots of pain, particularly in terms of hierarchies. Because the first hierarchy had to be the whole idea of the subjugation of women. And then, of course, from that, all the other subjugations and dominations were part of what men considered to be natural. So we all Homo sapiens, and there is but one humanity. As Mangaliso Subukwe said it many years ago, there is but one race, and that race is humanity. All people on the face of the earth are descendants from the earliest Homo sapiens on the African continent. There were Homo sapiens nowhere else on the earth except here on this continent. And all humans who people the earth are therefore direct descendants from this continent. Now I know that given the history, the material history, the economic history, and the political history of the last centuries, we find it sometimes difficult to believe that we can all be of the same humanity. But we are. We are of the same humanity. And African people, the great sages knew this before anybody. The only way we learned how to cross rivers to shelter ourselves was those early African people who taught us the very basic things, the fundamental things of crossing streams, of hunting, of sheltering, food processing. All of these things were discovered long before humanity left Africa. to go and explore other places. Before 70,000 years ago, everybody in the world was black because we had not left the continent. There had not been, and all of us didn't leave the continent. I always tell people, but everybody didn't leave the continent. Most of us stayed on the continent, right? We say, well, they left Africa. Yeah, but some left Africa 70,000 years ago. But most of the life of Homo sapiens, most of that life was spent on the continent of Africa, which means that's where we worked out all the details of what it's going to be and how it's going to be. So this is fundamental. The fact that we have lost that, the fact that we left part of that, is part of the problem that we have and part of where we have come to now in terms of understanding what is going on with life and with society. So that is part of our problem. I am now trying to manipulate my computer to get to the next slide. Okay. Thank you very much. And I do this one here. Okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so here we start. We start this. And we started with first of all, my recognition of Sobek Nafru, Hatshepsut, Yaninga, Ya Asantewa, Amanarinis, Amanashaketi. These are the names of great women of our past who were themselves exorcists. And the fact that we have not heard of them is sometimes an indication that we have, in fact, imbibed so much of Europe that if I were to speak to you of Queen Elizabeth, of Joan of Arc, you would say, yes, I know, right? It is the same. One of my great inspirations was a man by the name of Carter G. Woodson, who lived in the US and was the father of what they call Black History Month. And he said that after he left Harvard University, it took him 40 years to get Harvard out of his brain. And I always tell people that it has taken me even longer, it seems, to try to get UCLA out of my brain. It is difficult because what happens is that we recognize that if you tell me something, you give me information, I can tell you basically who conquered you. I can tell you conquest. I recognize the conquest in what you tell me and what you say because you express it in the words that you speak, in the language that you use. It's clear who your conquerors are. I have rid myself as much as I could of all my conquerors. And I try very much each day. And my wife can tell you, I'm so happy she's here. She can tell you if you want to ask her, say, Anna Yaninga, is it true that he tries to rid himself of conquerors? Yes, she'll tell you that. It is very, very true. Let's start at the beginning, and I'll explain it, and then I'll perhaps make a critique of it, and then I will give you some pointers, and then I will set this up for other conversations that I will have this week. First of all, the structure of Western knowledge. And when we say the West, we normally talking about Europe and white America. The structure of that knowledge, of the Western knowledge, really is at the forefront of our problems. That's the very beginning of our problem. And it's a problem that you have experienced here in South Africa, and the rest of us have experienced living in the West or somewhere else throughout the world. And that problem is that the notion of knowledge as developed in the West is a notion that works in the interest of white racial domination. That is the key to it. That's exactly what it's meant for. It has no other meaning. It has nothing but that. If you examine it, as many scholars have examined it, you finally come to a point of realization. You say, "Oh my goodness, that's what it's about." Let me show you how it works. If I were to ask people about any field that we have in the university, almost every field, at least when I was a student and I still teach at the university in Philadelphia at Temple University, almost every discipline starts with the Greeks. The Greeks are at the forefront of drama. They're at the forefront of logic, the forefront of philosophy, rhetoric, uh, the forefront of women's studies. Well, whatever it is, whatever the field is, you see a Greek sitting at the door. If it's not a Greek, then it's a Roman. Greece and Rome sit at the door of the knowledge of the Western world. Everything is derived from it. Think about it. It's not derived in the Western world from India or from China, certainly not from Nubia or Kemet. It is derived from Greece and Rome. It is almost as if nothing could occur or happen without the Greeks or the Romans, who are but children to Africans. That is what the truth is. But we'll get to that in a minute. But right now, think about this. I want you to think hard about it because I had to think hard about it. The idea that all useful knowledge begins with Greeks and Romans, whether it's political science, we say, oh, Plato and the Republic. We got it right now, right? If it's music, we say Theophrastus, the Greek, right? We got it. That every bit of our knowledge that has come to us in African universities, every bit of it, it seems there is a Greek, and if there is not a Greek, then there's a Roman sitting there. That is our problem. We have no claims. That's why we have no claims to the production of knowledge. Can you imagine that the oldest people in the world, the oldest Homo sapiens in the world, have no claim to knowledge? We didn't name the stars. We didn't name the days of the weeks. We didn't give our children names. We didn't know how to plant and harvest. Get out of here. That's insane thinking. You know what I mean? We are the very origin of humanity, at the very beginning of humanity. So what happened? How did this turn happen to us? Why is it that in African universities, whether they are here or whether they are in South America, which I've seen, like the University of the Pacifica in Colombia, or in the United States, like the so-called HDIs in the United States. Well, why is it that at those universities we have not been able to undo conquest in our brains? I'm telling you, this is a big problem and one of the fundamental problems. And the truth of the matter is, The truth of the matter is that in order for us to really understand what has happened to us, to see what has happened to us, we have to understand that truth is always found in facts. So I want to give you some facts that philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, law, the calendar that we use today, geometry, rhetoric, medicine, solemn ceremonies and rituals, and many other things originated here on the continent of Africa. So, philosophy? Yes, of course it did. Philosophy originated here. Africans were the first philosophers. Well, think about it. They don't teach us that in the Department of Philosophy. In the Department of Philosophy, the first philosopher is Thales. That's a Greek. I told you there was a Greek somewhere, right? The first philosopher, they say, is Thales. Thales lived 600 BC, 600 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Thales. They say the second Greek philosopher is Pythagoras. Pythagoras. He's after Thales. In fact, when he was 19 years old, he went to Thales and said, "Teach me what you know, Thales. I want to know what you know." And Thales said to him, "Young man, you must do as I have done and go to Africa and learn philosophy." That's what Thales told Pythagoras. But do we know that? No, they don't teach us that. Like, how did Thales get his knowledge? His own just came to him, right? Thales was a student in the Nile Valley. So if Thales got his knowledge from the Africans, then who were they if they were not the teachers? They were not philosophers of Thales. Thales, the first Greek, this is before, when you're talking about Thales and Pythagoras, this is before Socrates and Plato. Because once you get Socrates, and before, actually, let me give you the list as I remember it from UCLA. Right? Thales, Pythagoras, Isocrates, not Socrates. Isocrates comes before Socrates. Then Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That's basically the way it goes, right? So once you get this, you think you have something, you know something. And if you know all of that, and yet at the same time, you have never heard the name of Imhotep, Ptahhotep, Amenemhat, Amenemope, Merikari, Kunanu, Akhenaten, Amenhotep, the son of Hapu. Wait a minute. If you have never heard of the African philosophers who lived 2,000 years before Thales, then how can you know anything? Well, what can we start with? If you don't start with Imhotep, the first philosopher in the history of the world, who lived around 2,700 years before Jesus Christ, 2,000 years or more before Thales. This is African. So all children on the continent of Africa at least should know the name of Imhotep. That's the very first beginning. There should be universities named Imhotep University. The first philosopher in the history of the world. You see, that's the key. But the Western knowledge will never give you that because the Western knowledge is all about how do you glorify Europe. It will not give you that. You don't go that path. You don't even go the path of the Indians and get civilizations like Mohenjo-daro or Harappa. You don't get those. You don't go that way. You don't get the Shia dynasty of China either, which is around about 2200 BC. But you don't get Africa at all. I remember when I lived in Zimbabwe, there was a lecturer who came in 1980, 81 from Britain, and he was doing a lecture, something like this, at the university at the time, and I raised a question. I remember there was very few black people in the audience, and I stood up and I raised a question uh, to him because he had given a lecture on philosophy, and I said, Professor Ayers, you've given a talk for an hour and 30 minutes, and you've not mentioned any African philosophy, and you talked about the history of philosophy. And everybody was like very upset with me. I could feel the anger of the Rhodesians, oh, he's asking this great. So the man was wiser than his audience. He said, young man, I don't know anything about African philosophy. That's why I didn't mention it. So I said, that's a good answer. That's fine because I know you don't know, but the title of his lecture was The History of Philosophy. Nothing about Africa. And I'm like, wait a minute, we right here in Africa. You haven't even looked or examined Africa at all? No, you can't have knowledge like that. You cannot have that in this university, University of Zululand, this great university, who's on this beautiful path that the VC has articulated. You cannot have a university where you don't interrogate Africa. This is the first thing you interrogate. Your mother's soup is the first soup that you have before you go out into the world and talk about everybody else's soup. Oh, their mother's soup is good. Wait a minute, what about your own mother's soup? This is the first soup. You have to ask that question. Philosophy. The word philosophy, some people say word philosophy means lover of wisdom. In fact, what they will tell you in the West is that, well, philosophy, they don't have it in Africa, but what they did have in Africa was wisdom teaching. Well, wait a minute. The word Sophia, even if you take it in what the Greek meaning use of it now means basically wisdom. So why you just can't call it philosophy? Well, no, Africa doesn't have philosophy. They have stories. They have narratives. They may have myths and legends, but they don't have philosophy. Philosophy is only European because philosophy is reason. They don't have reason in Africa. You know what I mean? Come on, wait a minute. This is, I'm telling you, this is the thinking of the West. This is what gives them this notion that the production of knowledge could not happen on the continent of Africa because they are the only ones who have wisdom and reason. You see, real wisdom and real reason. But the word Sophia, Dr. Teofilo Benga of the Congo has shown that that word has its origin actually in the African word Seba, for which the Egyptians gave the word Sebayat, which meant teaching, deep, reflective teaching. Seba, teacher. That's an African word. That's where you get Sophia from, you see? Where you get Sufi from, etc., etc. This is a very powerful word, Seba. So this notion of Seba gives us this idea that this is a foundation here. And not only that, but the great King Antef II. There is a statement about Antef II. This is again around 2100 BC, where Antef says that the wise, and the word for wise is Seba, that the Seba gets up early in the morning, that the Sabah does not sleep until he has figured out things, and that the Sabah is moderate in his thinking and in his living. And so this is a whole passage on Antef and Sabah and the wisdom. This is long before philosophy was ever mentioned in Greece. 600 BC. Remember, I told you, Thales, 600 BC. This is going on in 2200 BC. I'm telling you, Imhotep lives 2700 BC. That's how long. In fact, the time from Imhotep to the time of Thales is about the time of us right now back to Jesus Christ. That's how distant it was that the Africans had already solved these problems and dealt with these things. I'm going to go quickly because I got so much to tell you. Astronomy, mathematics, law, the calendar we use today. This calendar we use is an African calendar. It didn't start, it's not a Roman calendar. It's not a Greek calendar. It's a calendar based on the rising of the Nile River with the star Sirius, a Sapdet, as the Africans called it. This is the begin. That's the beginning of it. That's where the calendar comes from. And this calendar that we have and that everybody uses all over the world now, this calendar is based on understanding that even though it was not perfect, you had about 5 days left over when you had the months of 30-day months. You had about 5 days left over, and those 5 days, they call them holy days. That's where we get holidays from. You see, Africans did that. This is what we said on this continent. That didn't happen in North America. It didn't happen in Europe or Asia. It happened in Africa. They said those days were days of celebration because we got to wait now until we see the rise of the star coming at the same time as the flood, the inundation of the Nile River. They figured that out. They were smart enough to do that. They gave us geometry. What is geometry? It means the measurement of the earth. Why did they have to measure the earth? They had to measure the earth because when the river Nile flooded, it destroyed farmlands. So how do you know how much farmland to give a farmer after the flood? You have measured the earth before with ropes. These were rope stretchers. What do the rope stretchers prepare you for? They prepare you for creating, ultimately, the pyramids. We'll come to that later. But this is important. This is very important. Geometry. They were not waiting for the Greeks. We don't even have Greek civilization when the pyramids were being built. There's no Greece. There's no Rome. There's no America, no Germany, no France. When the Africans and the Nubians and Kemites, because the word Kemet is an African word for what the Greeks call Egypt. Egyptus is a Greek word, but the Africans call it Kemet, the black land. Land of black people. That's Kemet. Kim. This is the beginning of history that we know of. And this gives us an idea that, well, why did they just ignore all of this and start with the Greeks? They even ignored most of human writings, all the writings that had been done by the people of Nubia and Meroitic and the people of Kemet and the ancient Egyptian language, Metanetia. They just ignored all of it, basically, because they came up with an idea that was different. Now, what we must do, we must challenge all forms of Western particularism. That's what we have to do. And the university has to do this. Students have to do it. You have to, there's no particular, I mean, you can't take a European particularism and try to make it universal. That's the whole idea. The idea for them was to take Europe's particular experience and make it universal. Say everybody have to learn that because this is the only way you can learn music. You got to learn the way we teach it because we're the only ones who know music. And our scale is the only scale. If you don't follow that scale, you can't. Wait a minute. Kwabena Nkatia, the Ghanaian musician, wrote a book called African Music. He said, wait a minute, our scale is different from the European scale. Our musicians have a whole different thing going on than what their musicians have going on. You can't do it. You can't say ballet is the only classical dance. It may be European classical dance, but the Chinese got classical dance too. The Japanese have classical dance. The Zulu have classical dance. What are you talking about? There's classical dance everywhere. You can't say theirs is folk dance, but ours is classical. Wait a minute. You can't allow that to happen. If you allow that to happen and you are university professors and administrators, then what you are doing is participating in the subjugation of other people. You can't do that. You raise these questions and you ask people to take care that they do not take a particularism of Europe and make it universal. Understand how the Pan-European Academy works. The Pan-European Academy, and this is not my phrase, it's a term that comes from the great Nigerian scholar Chinwezu. Chinwezu says the Pan-European Academy operates everywhere Europeans have been. That means that they assume that the only authorities that you have to cite or quote are Europeans. You can't write a paper and cite just Chinese writers or African writers. No, you got to have the European writers in there because that's how Europe maintains the Pan-European Academy. It keeps you thinking that the only people you can refer to are European writers. So what have I done? I just simply said, wait a minute. If I can find an African writer who said the same thing, I'm going to use the African writer. That's what Asante says. I said, wait a minute, why do I have to use European writer? Well, what are you talking about? You talking about general systems theory, and I have to use von Bertalanffy? No, I use Marcus Garvey, the greatest system thinker that I knew. What are you talking? What are you talking about? You're talking insane talk to me. You can't assume that just because I didn't cite this European writer, that somehow I don't understand this theory of this thing. No, you can't do that because Europe is very careful. They've created this system that you are locked into. You in the university, you're locked into the system. How you gonna get promoted? You got to make sure that you hit all those points. That's the academy. European Pan-European Academy. It's not a Pan-Chinese Academy, a Pan-African Academy. It's a Pan-European Academy. And that academy sets itself up as if it is the only academy that accounts. So we have to understand how it works. We have to combat systemic exclusion in concepts, events, and ideas. Any idea, you have to combat it. You have to say, I'll give you one example. At my university, we used to have a woman every year, one of our administrators who would get up and give a talk during commencement, and she would say, you know, this ceremony that we're having is a ceremony that dates back to medieval period, when the medieval priests and monks would dress up and I had to say, wait a minute, no, no, no. All solemn rituals and ceremonies, according to Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BC, and he was a Greek. He wrote
All solemn rituals and ceremonies are derived from the Africans. So wait a minute. So you're telling me this graduation exercise that we're going through, you're now even claiming that, saying this is part of the European. Wait a minute. No, the Europeans may have done it, but they did it long after the Africans had already done it. This is what the Africans were doing in the Nile Valley in 2200 BCE. They were doing this. They had their drums and their musicians and their dancers marching with the priests, and they would create these ceremonies. All and the Greeks said it themselves. All rituals, solemn ceremonies are created by these Africans. But we don't know that. So if we don't know that, we can't we can't even have an argument. One of the things, as a young person growing up in a family of, I had 15 siblings from a very peasant background, my home in Georgia. I was very poor kid. Growing up in this family of, with ancestors on my mother's side to go back to Sudan, and on my father's side to Nigeria, growing up in a segregated America, apartheid America, I always knew there was something wrong with this picture. That we as African people had achieved so much, but I didn't know what it was at that time. My father knew too, but he only went to the sixth grade. My mother only went to the third grade. But they knew there was something wrong with the picture that we had been given, you see? And I know that there are Africans on this continent who feel the same way. You know, something wrong with this picture. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And why is it this way? Because once I understood that, then I knew that by combating the systemic exclusion and concepts and ideas and really arriving at a different point, I would learn how to protect myself and other Africans from these vices that come with white supremacy. And one of them is the dislocation of our agency. Afrocentricity is the understanding that we are agents ourselves, that we are subjects. We are not objects. We're not on the periphery of Europe. We are not marginal to the European experience. We are ourselves in the center of our own history. And if we are in the center of our own history, we have to protect ourselves from the dislocation of our agency. Don't let people say, no, you don't have a role in this. You say, my role is central in this. If it's about Africa, it's definitely central. If you're dealing with me in Africa, I am at the center of the African experience here. This is what you have to see and understand. If you are at the center, then everything revolves around that center. You see? Then you don't want people to dislocate you from your culture. Culture is important. That's significant. It helps to reinforce values. That's what culture is used for. It reinforces the values. You don't want people to disrespect your ancestors. And what Europe did was to disrespect all of our ancestors. Oh no, your ancestors don't make any difference. You know, your ancestors don't matter. Our ancestors matter. That's why you have to quote them. You have to make sure that not only you quote them, you have to give your children our ancestors' names, not your ancestors' names. Give them our ancestors' names. This is the disestablishment of our history. And the disestablishment of our history is something that, yes, we can learn information, but once we learn this information, what we discover is that it is in the end that we lose our spirits, our souls. And we have gained all this information. I'm going quickly now. Western icons of knowledge: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Holy Bible, Athens, the Holy Roman Empire, Hegel, the, probably the greatest Western thinker, Karl Marx, Mary, Queen of Scots, Joan of Arc. You can add a million characters and icons to that list. That's the whole Western notion, the iconic notion of the West. What are the contributions of the West? The hero. They gave us the male hero. That's the West. That is the key. You gotta have a male hero who conquers all. They gave us inevitable conflict. The world is about conflict. West. They believe in that. That's the way it is. Not a world of peace. Conflict. Inevitable. That guilt is inevitable. Individual guilt. You walk around feeling guilty about something. That's an individualistic idea. That's not an African idea. No. Guilt is not an African idea. Shame is an African idea. Shame is collective. Guilt is individual. That's not us. Now, we can practice it, and we do. A lot of it, but that's not African. That's a different thing. You have to look at the thinking. They gave us heaven and hell. And nowhere in African culture have I seen that. Heaven and hell. I have not seen it. I'm serious. I've not seen it in any other. I've traveled all over this continent. I've lived on this continent. I don't see it. In the Africa, no. Even in the ancient civilizations of Africa, there was this notion of you at Judgment Day having your soul weighed by the feather of Ma'at. Your heart had to be lighter than the feather. That didn't mean you had to be perfect. It means your good had to outweigh your evil. That's an African concept. That's not perfection, but it's an African concept. Good outweighing evil. You see, it's very, very clear. That's the most ancient concept of the scale of justice we have. It's the African scale. The feather of Ma'at is light, but your heart should be lighter than that, you see. And if your heart is lighter than that, then you become an ancestor. If your heart is heavier than that, then some wild beast eat you up. You're gone, then you're finished. The personal God is not an African concept. Personal God, not an African concept. Evolutionary progress, that the longer we live, the more things happen, the more progressive we get. No, that's not an African idea. In fact, I look at what happened after COVID-19 in the United States. I mean, we lived more years, but we went back. We went backwards. This is not, you can't go but just believe that's because time passes, things get better. No, that's not true. You know, you have to think. They gave us what else did you gave us? They gave us cleverness instead of wisdom. Europe, yeah, cleverness. You can be clever. You can be a little 10-year-old child and be clever. Even have more cleverness than an 80-year-old woman or man. But you don't have wisdom. But you're clever. You can know how to fix things. You can do things. You know how to use a computer, you see. They gave us that. Europe gave us that. They took away the wisdom and gave us what they call merit. But what actually happened was that they destroyed the system, the moral and ethical system where we used to appreciate elders, where we used to respect women, and where we used to have, all that was destroyed because if you were clever, you could get around all those things. That's the way they did it, you see. Okay, we're coming to close here. They elevated the ranking of human beings based on physical traits. They gave us the colonial ideas of superiority and inferiority. They applied racial doctrines in education. They made Africans invisible. They made us invisible in everything, all science, all law. They made us invisible. The Africans just, even if we existed, they say, oh, no, I don't know anything about that, right? They also gave us information but they didn't treat us equal in the curriculum. So if you take your curriculum right now, whatever your discipline is, whatever your field, political science, psychology, whatever it is, I guarantee you that you do not have as many African scholars or writers that are referred to in those books and those disciplines as you have outside writers. I guarantee you that. In most disciplines, that's the way it is. That's how they. That's the training. You see, because this is invisibilizing us as we don't exist. You see, and this is the fundamental thing. So now, uh, the curricular responses to this is this: most Western nations are diverse because of colonizations. That's why they're diverse. And UK is trying to make sure they keep Africans out now. But they're diverse, but they created the problem in the first place. They went around the world, colonizing everybody. Now people say, I want to go to London. They said, don't come to London, right? U.S. is don't, U.S. conquered Mexico, took half of Mexico's property, land. Half of Mexico is not in the United States. California, Texas, that was all Mexico. They took it, and now they say the Mexicans don't come across the border. But this is their land. You conquered them, right? So what we also understand that Africans are exposed to Europe and America, but Europe and America are not exposed to African ideas. See, the reverse didn't happen. All Africans are exposed to European ideas or or American ideas, but America is not exposed to African ideas. We don't that can be taught. Kemet, Ma'at. I got it over there. Ma'at. All right. This is a concept, and I don't have time to explain it today. I'll explain it one day while I'm here. Kemet Ma'at. Kemet Sarujta. Very important concept, Sarujta. The Yoruba concept, Iwa Rere, the concept of good character. Very, very powerful. The Akan notion of Nanonome meaning ancestors. The Akan concept, Insa, meaning authentic. The Zulu concept, Ubuntu. I mean, all these concepts these are intellectual ideas. You can study them, just like you can study decoloniality. Just like you can study structuralism. You can study these ideas. These are ideas. These are African ideas. You can examine them. You can have people do critical studies about them. You see. Now, how to manage curriculum in a diverse environment? Chronology, mythology, and commonalities. Chronology, African origin. Always start with the African origin and you'll be okay. That's the beginning point. Second, mythology. Always look at what do African people say about themselves. What do they say? What do they? Zulus say we come from heaven, we from the sky, or from the earth, whatever. They say we're part of the cosmos. We're here with the cosmos. That's what the Zulus say. We just here with the cosmos. Wherever we here, we've been here. That's profound. You see what I mean? Commonalities. The pyramids are a common reservoir for all Africans when we talk about classical civilization. You don't have to go to Homer and the Odyssey. You don't have to go to that. Why are you going to that anyway? That has nothing to do with you. But the pyramids have something to do with you. And the pyramids are built almost 2,000 years before Homer. They have all the knowledge right there inside them. I've been in them. All the writing on the walls, some of them. It's right there. This is the origin of chemistry, the origin of biology, and a mummification. They studied science. The first medical books are African books. The first Mathematic books are African books. Now, European gave them different names. They call them the Moscow papyrus or the Rhine papyrus. They give them a name. So you don't even know they're your books. You see what I mean? That is very, very clever. That Africans don't even know that the earliest books of science are African books. I'm giving a lecture in a few months to the African scientists in Abuja, Nigeria. That's what I'm going to tell them. You're all scientists. We've got 1,000 black scientists. Let me tell you, you're all scientists. Did you know that the first books of science were African? First math books were African? Just that is that's our classical. That's why pulling from the classical civilizations. You see, okay, and uh, I think I'm coming to the end. Historical figures. Imhotep, the first philosopher, built the first pyramid. Ramses II. I'm just naming names. Hatshepsut, the greatest, one of the earliest and greatest female leaders. Hatshepsut. Amatorensis, who fought against the Romans, the Nubian queen. Antenor Firmin. You may have never heard of Firmin's name, but he was one of the greatest Africans to live. Haitian, who wrote a book on the equality of the races to combat all of the racist ideologies coming out of France. Sundiata, the great, built the Mali Empire. Abbot Lutuli, you should know. Alexander Pushkin. I stood at Pushkin's statue in Moscow about 3 years ago and honored this great African who was a poet who actually created the Russian language and made it the official language of Russia. People didn't know this. The official language of Russia used to be French, but it was the black man, Alexander Pushkin, who made Russian the language of the ordinary Russians, made it their official language. Amina of Zaria, the great woman, warrior, queen, and intellectual who led armies to fight for the rights of women. Toni Morrison, the greatest novelist who's lived in the United States of America. Abdias Nascimento, the great Brazilian nationalist philosopher, uh, one of the greatest humans I ever met in my life, uh, who was a politician, an artist, a dramatist, a great historian, Shaka the Great. Don't let people, let me tell you something. One of the other things that we have to do, and when I think of Shaka, I think of this. I met, before he died, several times because I knew him when he was alive. Mazizi Kuneni, met him at UCLA. He was teaching at UCLA. And then he came to see me when I lived in Harare. And one of the things we said is that what Europe tries to do with our leaders is to make them nothing. You know what I mean? They try to destroy them. They try to disfigure their history, their images, and so on. Europe is very dangerous at that. The U.S. does that too, and I'm from the U.S., so I know that. That's why we have to protect Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We have to protect their images because we know every day that people are trying to attack them. So you have to remember that. Sheikh Anta Diop, Sheikh Anta Diop, last name spelled Diop, the greatest African historian of the 20th century. Sheikh Anta Diop. Some people pronounce it Diop, but Diop, D-I-O-P. Go look him up, read his book. The African Origin of Civilization is what helped to give me my consciousness. Read Nelson Mandela, Wangari Maathai, whom I also met, Bantu Steve Biko, W.B. Du Bois, Tutmosis III. Who is Tutmosis III? The greatest warrior king who ever lived on the earth. Not Alexander, not Napoleon. Come on, I'm telling you, you got to know these things because that's how you defend yourself and assert your history and culture. Look, Alexander, I studied it. Alexander did 7 military campaigns. Back in those days, if you were a leader and you had a war, it was like, if uh, Netanyahu was a leader, you go into battle yourself. You lead the army into battle. That's what they did. They led the armies into battle. Alexander did it 7 times. 7 big military campaigns, came back alive, except the last. Thutmose III went into battle leading his army 17 times and came back alive. No king in history ever achieved what Thutmose III achieved. Don't let people fool you to tell you something else. So this is finally, this is a celebration of the diaspora. Zumbi of Brazil. Zumbi of Brazil. Never forget that name, Zumbi of Brazil. Yanga of Mexico. These are Africans now. Zumbi of Brazil, who created the first independence of Black people anywhere in the Western world. Zumbi. In the 1500s, Zumbi of Brazil. Yanga of Mexico, who in 1609 fought the Spanish and created his own province. A Congolese, Yanga. Muhammad of the Zanj rebellion, who in the 9th century, this era, revolted in Baghdad and brought Africans to freedom. This is where the name Azan, we talk about Azania, comes from the Zanj rebellion. You see? 900 AD. This African led this revolt of the Africans against Baghdad. Nanny of Jamaica. Never forget Nanny of Jamaica. She fought the British, led her armies, fighting the British, created her own area that was free of enslavement. Bioho Binkos of Colombia, another African. African that came up and said, no, I will not be enslaved, and led a group. And you can go right now to Colombia and go to Palenque and visit the place where he had his capital. This is this Toussaint Louverture of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, who was just a servant, driving a carriage for the white dignitaries, who created an army that liberated millions. And Dessalines, who succeeded Toussaint Louverture and won the victory against Leclerc, Napoleon's general. And I never forget Nat Turner of the US and Harriet Tubman, who saved 1,000 enslaved Africans. So today, I've just laid down the beginning. We will carry forward with this on the next 2 or 3 days while I'm here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Asante, thank you very much for that inspiring lecture. Now we have, the comments on the line. He says, Viva, Professor Sante, Viva. Uh, and I think uh, Professor Brown would have a way of saying Viva differently. Without waste of time, may I call Professor Byron Brown.
Viva! Viva, Professor Asante, viva, indeed. Professor Sepe, allow me to acknowledge, first of all, our distinguished top table. And of course, I'm reminded that we have members of council online. So I acknowledge them and also here acknowledge our VC of Ntosi, our keynote speaker, Professor Asante and his wife. Of course, our DVCs, deans, executives, and other distinguished participants here present and online. Viva! Good morning. Professor Asante, I know it's very hard to pick up on the broad spectrum of issues that you raise, but let me begin by sharing my admiration and saying congratulations to you for being a pioneer and a leading voice in this area of scholarship, which develops, in my view, an approach of pedagogy centered on on the cosmology of the African child or the African person. I think you deserve a round of applause. You introduced the concept of Afrocentricity, which came out quite strongly in your presentation. At a time when it was not popular for Black academics to do so, or at a time when it was not fashionable for African scholars to dominate the intellectual source around a major idea in terms of research and writings. I'm only speculating, but it must have been quite unsettling for the white or non-African scholars who are accustomed to being the ones unleashing big ideas and concepts onto the world, or presenting themselves as owners of the cognitive empire, as Gasheni Unglobu would say. And I think just listening to you and where you ask us to begin to think about ourselves, to self-reflect, for me, illustrate that point very well. I'm sure you have a story to tell in that regard, but nevertheless, I congratulate you for standing out as a pioneer. I'm not sure, I didn't get your paper in advance, so well, we don't normally do. So my response here will largely focus on the insights I gain by listening. For me, and perhaps the audience, I experienced this lecture as one that was quite thought-provoking, educative, inspirational, but equally one that put forward a significant challenge to our academic community to think deeper, to think wider, and to engage in our development of our pedagogical practice. And I will share in my response why I think this way in terms of the issues that I pick up in your lecture. But Professor Sepe, you would agree with me that the challenge to think deeper comes at the right time, because we are at the initial phase of a very long journey of trying to reform an apartheid and colonially crafted university into an authentic African university. Professor Asante, I find your deliberate emphasis on pedagogy and the history around knowledge development, but particularly on the issue of pedagogy as a science as well as an art, quite insightful. Now, I interpret your focus on the historical, the methodological, the philosophical, and theoretical component of your Afrocentricity uh, approach to as you have pointed out so well. And you have given us names. I find that quite interesting that you go that deeply. And this is telling us that there's still far that we have to go, not grasping our own history of knowledge development. Now, all of this has led to a number of consequences. One of them being Africans have been educated away from themselves. Without knowing, we have been educated away from ourselves. Africans are attached merely on the fringes of European culture and European cosmology through our education system. Our learning is not grounded in our cosmology, and we, in the end, get absorbed in the cosmology of Eurocentrism. As a result, and we have quite a number of psychologists talking to this, Africans suffering psychological and cultural death. And of course, Fanon being a major one, talking about the daily death that we experience. But equally, you might be aware of Dr. Amos Wilson and how the psychologist, and he talking about the two personalities that we face or that we experience. The personality that is ours, inherited, the personality that is imposed or that is entrenched through colonialism in us. So our own personality and the personality that is acquired through sort of education that we are exposed to. These are the clearest reminder for me that African learning experience is not situated in the African cosmology, and you have called on us to reverse that. In fact, the words that you use, we must dismiss Eurocentrism and Eurocentric particularism. Dismiss it as something that should never be seen as universal. You've also called on us to draw instead on African intellectual sources, find our scholars, make use of the knowledge that we have in our context, combat systemic racism, combat systemic epistemicide, linguicide, historicide. These become the dominant concepts for us to begin to reframe our pedagogy. The fundamental concept for an Afrocentric education and curriculum are quite clear. And I have two words, two concepts that I've extracted from your talk. One, the centrist paradigm, and two, situated learning. If we are not building our knowledge and our pedagogy on a situated learning paradigm or the centrist paradigm, we are going to continue to struggle. That's the message I pick from your deliberation. I also see substantial alignment between the concepts of the Afrocentricity philosophy and the decolonial philosophy. I know in the US, you have not been confronted per se by issues of colonialism or neocolonialism. The issue in the US has largely been more around race and gender and the, as you mentioned, the domination of white supremacist ideals. But outside the US, as you have rightly pointed out, particularly in Africa, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean, as you mentioned, those regions which have gained independence following the end of slavery and apartheid, they have been confronting the relics of colonialism and the birth of neocolonialism, and now more recently, the Western modernism. Scholars in these contexts have put forward a few concepts, one of them being decoloniality or the decolonization as the major thrust to get out of that entanglement. So there is this big call in decolonization to de-link from the entanglement of coloniality or to rebel epistemicide, linguicide, historicide, and so on, as Gachene Nglobo and others would mention. But it is interesting for me to see how scholars confronted by particular contextual issues, US, Africa, and elsewhere in the South, responded in a manner that bears so much similarity. Because all of what you have said, for me, I'll narrow it down to situational learning. And this is exactly what the decolonialists have called for. And so they've put forward 4 approaches to decolonize pedagogy, to decolonize the curriculum, to decolonize education. 1, and we have put some of these in our own framework as a university. One of them is the insurgency pedagogy. And we have quite a number of writers on that particular branch or string. Then the pedagogy of activism, the pedagogy of vulnerability, and of course, humanizing pedagogy. Now, I mentioned these because I want to locate you, and you'll guide me here when you come back. I want to locate Afrocentric pedagogy and the push to situate learning within the context of insurgency pedagogy. That's where I locate the call, the curriculum response that you mentioned, that we should not stay quiet, but instead hunt down all the sources that guide us in terms of our own understanding of maths. You know, when I was still in university, I used to try source this math. I do have a copy of math, and there's such similarity between it and the Bible. When you look at even the 10 Commandments, you wonder who copied from where. You know, but all these sources and the sequence in which you have outlined for us to begin to think about the way we structure our learning and our curriculum and our pedagogy, to begin in that chronological order, for me, is part of what I'm beginning to think about in terms of an insurgency. We have to go in and make some adjustments and change and recreate and shift away from and de-link from the Eurocentric paradigm that we know. So there's that similarity for me, and this is how I'm thinking about it, that we see synergy between what you're saying as Afrocentricity and the knowledge structure and what decoloniality, the philosophy of decoloniality is calling for. Now, I have a couple of questions here. Maybe you could shed a bit of light for me on the knowledge structure, the Afrocentric pedagogy that you've pushed forward in your speech, relative to these approaches that decolonial scholars have put forward: insurgency, activism, vulnerability, and humanizing pedagogy. Where are the overlaps? Where are the deviations? Maybe you could shed a bit of light on that. The other point as well is, how do we begin to roll out these ideas that have been tabled before us, especially in the context of the Eurocentric environment that we still function in? Maybe a bit of light on those could help as well. The other issue that, and this is my final area that I want to raise, is around, I can understand and relate to the issues that you raised as important from an Afrocentric point of view. But what sort of a human resource is needed to drive this sort of agenda? Because we are still framed within the context of a Eurocentric environment, and we need to unravel and get ourselves out of it. But what kind of human beings, what kind of human resources do we need in the university, and the skill set to really take us away from this, especially in relation to the point I made earlier, where implementers of the curriculum sometimes tend to shy away from participating in the development of methods of teaching. So let me summarize, Prof. Asante, by saying that I believe the ideas that you've pushed forward hold great potential for the decolonial agenda that the university is championing. The various concepts that you have put forward and the call for us to know thyself are quite important. And that is where, for me, the challenge lies in terms of us rethinking and further deepening our thought around pedagogy and the way we think about reforming our own university. Thank you very much.
Professor Brown, thank you very much for distilling the presentation by Professor Sante, and I see that you didn't get my memo about also what you're supposed to do. Professor Sante was here to provoke us so that we can go and do a homework. But you took it upon yourself also to provoke him. So I see that there's a lot of provocation taking place here. So what I'm going to do, and because I also do not want him to provoke you again, and he has done enough, and he's going to be here. Some of the questions that he's going to be responding to will be in the lecture that he's going to give. He's here with us. So I'm also trying to restrain him from allowing himself to be provoked to respond fully to you. So what I'm going to ask Professor Asante is to say just in a nutshell some of the issues, but some of those he'll be able to pick up later in the lecture. He's with us for the whole week. And in addition, I know there are some people who have been sufficiently provoked, who have asked questions. We're going to make sure that we put them to Professor Sunday so that he can pick up on those later. And of course, what it also means is that he'll probably have to write another book to clarify some of these issues. So, Professor Sunday, yeah, sure.
I don't understand why we put colonial in the middle of African history. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I have no understanding of that. The history of Africa is so old, so long, and it's been so around. The colonial experience for most African people was only less than 200 years. And so, I mean, you talk about thousands of years of history. Why is this? Why are we going to put Europe at the center of our conversation? Let's forget Europe. What is that? What we do is to assert ourselves. It's the assertion of Africa that I have always argued has to be out front. And let me tell you why this is important. This is important because otherwise we're always participating in other people's ideas. I don't have anything wrong. I like Maldonado. I like Walter Mignola. These are people that I read. But they got a whole different, they talk about situation. They have a whole different situation in the South America. The South American experience is not the African experience. It is not the African American experience for sure. So there is something else that's going on here. It is all right for them to talk about decoloniality if that's what they want to talk about. I don't want to talk about that, and I will explain why I don't want to talk about it in my next paper.
I knew this will come, and it's necessary because we should not. It's one of those things where you are easily sidetracked, and a bone is thrown, and you go for it, and then you get decentered. Afrocentricity is about centering the African experience. It's about making sure that you place the African experience at the center of your analysis. And this is why, Vice-Chancellor, having spent a bit of my sleeping time going through Professor Asante's book, I was as provoked as I was in the 80s when we first met. And I've still found the material as profound as it was then and as it is now. But what it does is to challenge and take to task this perpetuation of ideas that are foreign, that are supremacist, and to take them to task and remove them from the imagination of the African world, because that's where the problem is, that we end up in a space of negation as opposed to the space of affirmation. You spend most of your time quarreling with others instead of advancing your own view. And the energy that you spend in quarreling instead of coming up with your own. And this is what Afrocentricity is all about. And I would urge that we should actually, the librarian should make sure that we have as many books on Afrocentricity as possible so that our colleagues can participate in what Professor Mdose called intellectual exorcism. That we need a lot of that, including, oh, I think you can exclude me on that one. This other, because I'm so urbanized that the other things that Professor Mtosi was talking about will not fit into my biology. But all in all, Afrocentricity is about shifting the biology of reason and the geography of reason. It is about putting Africans in the center. It is a mode of thought and action in which the centrality of African interests, values, and perspectives predominate. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I have indicated that Professor Sante will be here and Professor Mlomo is here, and you know her email address, you can channel a number of questions. And I've, as I said, Professor Asante has an assignment of another book. He has written more than 100 books. Maybe I don't know whether we're being too unfair to him. Having written 500, now he's given another assignment of another, actually more than 100, another assignment of another book. But I think in the nature of clearing the cobwebs in our brains, it might be something that is necessary as part of the intellectual engagement. I would like to call um, Professor Kunene. Uh, Apologies for those who have pressing questions, but Professor Nomlomo will make sure that those are channeled to Professor Asante, who's going to be with us for the next coming few days. Professor Kunene, are you ready? And this should not be another provocation.
Thank you, Program Director. Members of Council who are present here online, our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mtoshe, fellow divisions, executive management, deans, distinguished guests, especially our guest speaker, Professor Kente Asante, and his wife, Prof. Anna Yenanga. Honorable participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and students that are here online, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to propose this vote of thanks. We've just concluded an enriching and insightful webinar on governing concepts for an Afrocentric pedagogy. I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor Asante for sharing your valuable expertise with us today. Your thought-provoking presentations has illuminated our understanding of the critical role that education can play in reclaiming African heritage. Your expertise and passion has inspired us to continue relooking our approaches to teaching and learning and to center African perspectives in our educational practices. I would also like to express our sincere gratitude to the leadership of the institution, our visionary leader, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mtose, for championing the promotion of the African thought in our institution. Your commitment to making UniZulu the node of African thought has created a transformative impact on our academic community, and your leadership has encouraged critical thinking of indigenous knowledge, promoted African perspectives in curriculum development, as well as promoting research initiatives focused on African solutions. And indeed, your opening talk today on intellectual exorcism is another of your contributions in promoting of the African thought towards decolonization. Thank you, Professor Byron Brown, for your thoughtful response to our guest speaker's presentation. Your insightful comments deepened our understanding of the Afrocentric principles, and thank you for your thoughtful analysis. Sincere appreciation to our chairperson of the webinar, Professor Sipho Siepe, and the organizers. Thank you for ensuring that we get these webinars, which are very encouraging, and they keep us glued on this project of keeping UniZulu as the node of the African thought. Thank you to the communication department, the ICT team, for ensuring the seamless execution of our VC webinars. Your attention to detail always makes the difference. Thank you to all the participants in the venue, of course, and those online. Of course, we've had their comments, and now Prof. Asante has now a job to write another paper. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting again in the next VC webinar. Thank you very much. So this webinar is closed. Thank you.